So this is a Nintendo cartridge. These early NES and Famicom games were a format that pretty much introduced most people to home console gaming, and even though they have been introduced in Japan in 1983, they have continued to be extremely popular as a format for longer than you might realize. If you open up any of these game cartridges, you will find a simple circuit board with a male connector, usually with gold or silver looking pins, as well as some basic circuitry, perhaps some passive components, some microcontrollers, and ROM chips containing the actual game data. On some more advanced cards, you also might find a coin cell battery which is used to store your save files. Their next console, the Super Famicom or SNES in the rest of the world, used pretty much the same concept, just with bigger sized ROMs, as well as some additional circuitry in some cases. Some games contained additional sound or graphics co-processors inside, as well as multi-memory controllers. And that was all standard practice. I mean, most consoles during the 80s used cards in some form or another, but in the late 90s, Nintendo infamously continued using cartridges, foregoing the increasingly popular CD-ROM format, which led to other game companies, namely Sony, eating their lunch, since many third-party developers didn't want to stick with the limited, outdated, and more expensive ROM cards. And while Nintendo did eventually switch to using discs in their home consoles, starting with the GameCube in 2001, it was a weird mini DVD-based format, which they thankfully later substituted for a full-size DVD format on the Wii, and then later for a Blu-ray-based disc on its successor, the Wii U. But interestingly, Nintendo still used cartridges on their handheld systems, the Game Boy line of products, and then later they switched to what they called Nintendo Game Cards. And yeah, there's an argument to be had about whether these are related to the earlier ROM cards, but in my opinion they're very similar, just smaller and more consolidated. Most of them have EEPROMs as well to which you could save your data, except for the Switch where data is saved to the internal memory, as well as flash ROM chips for storing the actual game data. So yeah, that's a brief overview of Nintendo's formats for you, and as you can see, their format of choice seems to be cartridges, and there's a number of reasons for that, one of the largest ones being security and anti-piracy. However, some people may not be aware that Nintendo did use another widespread and extremely popular data storage format, one that was not only cheaper to produce, could initially hold more data than cartridges, and was rewritable, so that you could write your own games to it. And yeah, they had to ruin it by using their own proprietary format. It was Mitsumi's Quick Disk, but still an official Nintendo floppy disk you can load Famicom's game from? The heck did you play these things on? Well, initially you'd have to buy a Famicom disk system, an add-on to the Japanese Famicom, but if you wanted to be extra fancy, you could get yourself a Sharp Twin Famicom. Oh yeah, this puppy plays both Famicom cartridges and these weird floppy disks since it has a disk drive built in. Now this was always fascinating to me, with Nintendo being such a closed off company, to see an officially licensed third-party console on the market at the same time. Anyway, I got this thing a couple of years ago. I ordered it from Japan with a bunch of games, and back then it didn't cost me that much. I remember getting a couple of other systems too, because they were cheaper than here, or it was something that you just couldn't get locally. Nowadays they seem to be a bit more expensive. They go for around 150 bucks, and there's a couple of color variations too. It came to me loose without the box or the power supply, and being a Famicom, the controllers are conveniently wired up to the main unit. Now this thing has the exact same barrel jack for power as the more familiar NES or the SNES, but it takes a slightly lower voltage. The NES works on 9 volts, while this thing wants 7.5 volts. To be honest, these older bastards are far less sensitive than the newer circuitry, so it'd probably be just fine using a 9 volt power supply, as long as it provided enough amps and was the right polarity, but it could lead to long-term issues, so I wanted to use something more appropriate, and I remember making myself a power supply when I first got this console, but I can't for the life of me find where it is, so I guess I'll show you now how I did it. I used a PS2 power supply which provides 8.5 volts, which is close enough, and I had no problems running it for hours on end. But the issue is that power supply has a smaller barrel jack at the end, and it just won't fit the Twin Famicom's end, so I've snipped it off and soldered in a bigger barrel jack. It's not very pretty, but hey, it does the job as you can see, and it has plenty of power. I think it will do something like 4 or 5 amps, which is awesome. The seller said the console powers on and works fine with the cartridges, but that the floppy disk unit doesn't read disks. And that's one of the great things about cartridges. If they're clean, they're pretty foolproof. There's very little that can go wrong. Well, apart from damage traces or chips burning out, but I found that rarely happens. With floppy disks and CDs, yeah, you're going to run into reading issues eventually. Either the media itself will become unreadable due to it getting damaged or dirty, or the drive itself will eventually crap its pants. We've all run into dead lasers, I'm sure, but with these floppy drives and also tape drives, the most common issue by far is perishing rubber belts. These guys have mechanisms that are driven by a motor and a pulley connected together using a rubber belt, and after 30-40 years, those belts have either completely disintegrated or they have become too loose or sticky and they need to be replaced. And sure enough, after popping in the disc and trying to load it, we just get a fast-paced sound of a running motor, but nothing is moving and the console is unable to read the game. So it looks like we'll have to fix this thing up if I want to demonstrate and enjoy this weird Nintendo format for the first time. I never had one of these apart, although I did work on quite a few NES consoles, and this one disassembles much in the same way, with some screws at the bottom, after which you can take the top off and you have access to all the innards. We pretty much have three things here: a power supply that brings that input voltage down to 5 volts, the motherboard, and the floppy disk drive, along with the controller. These are all separate units, so we can just take out the drive and work on that. There's a little cover we can take off, and underneath we have a controller board with some sensors and a cable leading to the read head. I took off the screws and these little plastic standoffs, but I really didn't want to take the whole thing apart because from experience I know how easy these things are to mess up and put back together once the inner clockworks go spring and sproing. I mean, you have like a dozen springs in there that are ready to fly across the room, never to be found again. Also, if you do take the whole mechanism apart, along with the read head, it's very likely it's going to be misaligned once you try putting it back together, and you won't be able to properly calibrate it afterwards. So I'll just gently try doing what I came here to do, which is changing out the drive belt. Bits of it were already coming off, pieces were falling on my table here, so yeah, the belt had perished. Fortunately, it didn't turn to black tarry goo, which they tend to do sometimes, and that's a pain in the ass to get off. As it is, I just blew some remaining bits out of there and used some IPA to get all the remaining stuff off the pulleys. It took a bit of time, but I eventually got all of it off. One problem I've noticed immediately was that this thing was using a flat belt. Now I do have one of those assorted belt kits I got ages ago, and it came in very handy for repairing tape drives and other stuff, but they are all little square diameter belts, which is not what was in here before. But since I didn't have a better option, I just looked for a suitably sized belt in that kit and decided to give it a go. And that's just how life is sometimes, you know. I could have probably gone on eBay and bought a compatible belt for cheap, but then I'd have to wait for it to arrive, and I already have this thing in pieces here on my desk, so we'll see if we can make do with what we have. Now the other thing is I had no idea how to properly install a belt in this thing. I didn't know what the correct belt path was, nor how it should be seated. I've tried putting this belt cover back in, but it had a gear permanently attached to it, so I had to figure out how to get it in and off, and having that board dangling on there certainly didn't make it any easier. And you might naturally ask why I didn't go look for a tutorial video or schematics or something, and I did look briefly for a schematic diagram online, but I wasn't able to find one. And the truth is, sometimes this is half the fun of doing a project. I mean, if you're not in a hurry and you're not doing this for a client or something, just taking your time, figuring out how it goes together. I mean, this is like a jigsaw puzzle for men in their 30s. I grew up playing with Legos, and now I take shit apart and try fixing it. Okay, so I don't really know how, but I got the belt on, and it seems to be working. I don't think this thing is falling off. I've probably spent like half an hour playing with this, and eventually I did get it to all fit how it should, I think. But there's no doubt in my mind that that wasn't the correct way of doing it. I don't even know how I did it at the end. It's like solving a Rubik's Cube. Sometimes you get lucky and it all just kind of solves itself if you fiddle with it for long enough, but you have no idea how it got there. Anyway, the belt seemed to fit fine. It didn't look like it was just going to fall off, so I reassembled everything somewhat just so I could test it out, and I couldn't freaking believe my luck. Oh my god! Oh, let's go! Ah, oh, it's volleyball! Oh my god! Oh, hell yeah! my god, I never thought I would play this on the Famicom. That's super cool to play this on original hardware. I'm so happy. Get the fuck away. I only ever played this on the All-Stars version, and I of course played that on the emulator. I mean, it worked first try. I can't say that happens too often. So I've enjoyed some downtime playing this game on real hardware for the first time ever, and it felt pretty dang satisfying. Afterwards, I wanted to reassemble this thing and give it a nice little clean. Even though the console wasn't terribly dirty, it was really in quite a nice shape. There was this glue residue I wanted to clean off, so I've tried my alcohol solution, but it wasn't really working, so I've used WD-40, which works well for getting glue off of plastics, and it's very gentle. I've sprayed some on there and then used a paper towel to scrub it off, and it eventually came right off. I've also cleaned out the controllers. I've used a toothbrush dipped in alcohol to just remove some of the finger gunk that was left there after Lord knows how many hours of play. And I've also cleaned out the cables, which are usually the dirtiest parts of any console, deceptively so since they're black, but they were pretty nasty. And you might have also noticed this weird little white pigtail cable coming out of this thing's behind, and I have absolutely no idea what that's about. It's definitely some sort of a user installed mod, and it seems to be wired into this thing's expansion ports. Measuring it, it seems to provide 5 volts to one of the pins. If anyone knows what that thing connects to, let me know in the comments, but judging by some of the expansion cables I found for it, perhaps it's something that hooks up to like a ROM loader. I don't know. Anyway, after cleaning the console and reinstalling all the screws, I've set it up and tried it out. And I got a battery error. Cool. After thinking about it for a second, I've realized I've probably forgot to plug the damn thing in. So off with the screws, off with the top, and yep, that was pretty dumb. I've plugged the drive in, closed it up, and error 22. After looking it up, I could see that that was most likely the read head alignment issue, which was super confusing because the thing was just reading the disk perfectly not 10 minutes ago. So here comes the stage of any good repair. You all know the story, you're working along, everything seems to be going alright, and then at the very end the thing just gives up on you. So I've spent the rest of that afternoon tinkering with this thing, whispering sweet Balkan swear words to it in hopes it would just start working again. I've tried readjusting some cams, cleaning out the old grease from the rails and putting some new lithium grease, cleaning the read head. I've reassembled the thing like 10 times, and then for some reason it just started working again. So somewhere along the lines it got fixed, and I don't give a crap where. At that point I've put it all back together and enjoyed playing some volleyball and Super Mario Bros. 2. Oh yeah, this is another cool feature of the FDS. Most discs have 2 games on it, 1 per side, and since the games were rewritable, you would have like a kiosk you could bring your discs to and write new games to them. You never really know what you're going to get if you're buying these things online, unless the seller had tested the discs beforehand. If you'd like to know more about the Famicom disk system, I highly recommend watching The Gaming Historian. He made a great episode about it a couple of years back. I enjoyed watching it very much, one of the reasons why I wanted to get one for myself. And this is quite a neat console, beautiful too, and knowing that it's fully working now just makes me happy. And I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this weird Nintendo format with me, maybe you even learned a thing or two. Like, if something is broken, there's no harm at giving it a go, even if you're a dumbass like me, and even if you don't have proper tools, parts, or know-how. I mean, this is a perfect example. I probably did so many things wrong, from the janky power supply hack to the improper belt I've used, but look at it, it's playing games, and to me, that's all that matters. And if you enjoy watching me doing half-assed repairs, there's plenty more of that here on my channel. I do repairs, overviews, retrospectives, and all sorts of other things, so you might want to consider subscribing. I do videos every week, and if you'd like, you can also support what I do on Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. You can join for as little as $1 a month, or more if you'd like. If you'd like to chat with me and other members, you can join our Discord server. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.